Barb, would you help lead us again in our opening song? We've done a call and response kind of singing the past couple weeks. Although most of us will have to remain muted, I guess this week I'll stay unmuted and sing Tim's part as we lead back and forth.
Thanks, Caleb. I thought, well, maybe we know it well enough that we might not, but that'd be great if you would be that the echo in our song today, the Be With Us Now by Brett Hessla. So echo me. God of earth,
God of earth,
and every creature,
and every creature,
God of wind,
God of wind,
and God of the sky,
and God of the sky,
God of old,
God of old,
and new creation,
and new creation,
be with us now,
be with us now,
be with us now,
be with us now.
God who grieves,
God who grieves,
the death of nature,
the death of nature,
God who grieves,
God who grieves,
this poisoned land,
this poisoned land,
God who grieves,
God who grieves,
at our indifference,
at our indifference,
be with us now,
be with us now,
be with us now,
be with us now. As we read through our scripture and another song of worship, we will be reading the short verses interspersed by verses of a song recorded by a choir in South Africa. So we realize the song will be interrupted for our scripture reading. Just a repeated moment of reflection as we realize that the topics this week in particular are heavy. The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left.
The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left.
The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left.
For this recording, we ask you to sing along, unmute if you, well, stay on mute, but sing along if you'd like. And thanks again to Barb and to Dan Royer Miller.
Where are the voices for the earth? Where are the eyes to see her pain? Wasted by our consuming path, weeping the tears of poisoned rain. Where shall we run who break this code? Where shall tomorrow's children be? Left with the ruined gifts of God, death for the creatures, land and sea. We are the voices for the earth. Cherish her beauty, clear her breath. Live that our planet may not Zenzenina, 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 Zenzenina,
Would you pray with me? God of all creation, we're going to discuss today things that are heavy and difficult. What have we done to this beautiful earth of yours and to our brothers and sisters who are so often the ones most vulnerable, most impacted, had the least to do with the damage they suffer from? As we reflect today, God, we pray that we would feel not a shame that paralyzes us if we have been complicit in the violence done to this world and to our brothers and sisters, but fill us with the kind of guilt that leads to repentance where that is appropriate, and the renewed energy to take action to turn things around. We pray that you prepare each heart here gathered on Zoom tonight and those who watch this recording later on, that this may be a time to work in our spirits for the good of this earth. Amen.
Thank you, Caleb and Barb and the others of the worship group. And welcome to this, the third session on who still cares about climate change, faith responses to denial and despair. And in this third session, we move into something that was talked about at the end of our previous session, as Caleb mentioned in his prayer, how the climate impacts often fall most aggressively, most destructively on those least responsible for it. And so we're bringing two perspectives tonight on climate justice from Dr. Sibonokuhle Ncube from Zimbabwe. Will be speaking first, and I will, I think I'll go ahead and introduce both of you, and then the Reverend Marcia Dinkins will be speaking after that. Dr. Ncube has served as the National Coordinator of Compassionate Development Service, the Relief and Service Agency of the Brethren in Christ Church of Zimbabwe, and through that, then being a partner of Mennonite Central Committee. She's currently a student at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. She has almost 20 years of experience in various development contexts, including climate change management, climate finance, governance, disaster preparedness, and she has served as deaconess at the Mount Pleasant Brethren in Christ Church in Harare, Zimbabwe, and she currently lives in Goshen, Indiana. Reverend Marcia L. Dinkins is the Executive Director of Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, addressing climate justice issues. She's also the founder and Executive Director for Black Women Rising. She's a native of Detroit. She's owned and operated a medical clinic for unserved and underserved populations and has worked for child welfare in both Michigan and Ohio. Currently, she's a PhD candidate at Union in Cincinnati. Reverend Marcia holds degrees from Oakland Community College and Toledo University, holding an MA in Criminal Justice Administration and Policy and multiple certifications related to child welfare. And so, Sibonokuhle, I now will pass it over to you. We look forward to you engaging us.
Thank you, Pastor Doug. I would like to greet our collective tonight in the name of Jesus. That gives me great hope for a better day as I see the people of God congregating at this time. I'd like to make special mention of an apprentice that I have in the group. I'd like to make a special mention of Sarah Gurule, who is also a student with me at the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary and a natural saint in very many ways. I would like to share my screen tonight and speaking to you also as a member of or an intern at the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. Just trying to sort out my screen. I don't know how I can make this ribbon. Okay, there you go. Trying to move my ribbon. Right, can you see me?
Yep, that's good now.
Right, thank you. So I will contextualize my presentation using a presentation I have shared many times at many fora with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. And whilst tonight, the overarching concern is who still cares? I'd like to bring it down to actually who is under your carbon footprint. And perhaps at the end, we might end up asking who is actually under our carbon footprint. Why it is that we as people of faith, as ministers from the pulpit, the pew, and out in the fields, should be interested and be leading from the front. I come from the land of Zimbabwe, which is in Southern Africa, and I'm glad Baba Bruno Berg is here to testify of that. This is a real place, landlocked by 4 borders of 4 countries right down there in Southern Africa, and Zimbabwe is just about a 14th, or maybe it's a 25th of the size of the United States of America. And I bring special greetings from my husband and 3 daughters. These 3 daughters are here with me in Goshen, Indiana. And I partly do this work not only because of the love of God, but also because I'm interested in bequeathing them a better world. In Zimbabwe, we love to farm. 70% of our gross domestic product historically has come from agriculture. We're also a country, I come from a country of many beautiful sights and scenes. Sadly, we have become a highly informal economy with 95% unemployment and everybody trying to sell something to somebody, to the next person. Despite great hopes at independence in 1980, something has continued to go terribly wrong. So wrong, perhaps from the time when Adam lost it himself. And some of the issues that I want to touch on today are to give us here a brief description of what has been happening in Southern Africa and in Zimbabwe because of the changing climate, and thereby give you some contextual issues and impacts that are specific to the region and also sadly generic to most of the global south of the world conceptually. And I will raise today moral and spiritual questions, such as how the faith community can frame a creation care and a collaborative brother or sister keeper's response. I will share what I have been doing together with the churches, the government, and civil society, and perhaps begin to suggest what we can urgently do together at multi-level and global scale. As a development pundit, I must admit that even before the pressure from the shifting climate hit the global south has been struggling with governance issues, bad government, corruption, poor administration, and just a paucity of the rule of law. And I enjoy being in discussion with a development practitioner called Paul Collier, who also says, apart from all these factors I've mentioned, the global South struggles because of the harsh climate. And perhaps this is part of why you find that the bottom billion of the 8 billion alive today is in the global South. But who is behind the harsh climate? And I want to introduce some leaderboards and perhaps insinuate, some would say, or give an idea of where culpability lies generationally. I'd like to talk a little bit about the emissions Olympics, with the changing climate producing a world of haves and have-nots. And we are currently experiencing a climate apartheid. The last Olympics in 2016, which didn't happen this year because of the pandemic, show us that the United States of America was surely leading from the front in sporting gold medals, silver medals, and bronze medals, followed by the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, Australia, and so on. At this point, China was like way down there at the bottom. And that is sporting. Let's talk about the carbon footprint. When we look at per capita carbon dioxide emissions in the world's largest economies as of 2016, and by the way, this data hasn't changed much, the United States leads again on this leaderboard, followed by Canada, South Korea, Russia, Japan, Germany, and suddenly China is much closer than much closer to the United States. And when we look at largest producers of territorial fossil fuel, carbon dioxide emissions worldwide as of 2017 and still rolling on the same trajectory, suddenly we have China leading from the top, followed by the United States, India, Russia, Japan, and more of the same names we've been seeing across the boards. This becomes an interesting infogram to me as I engage us tonight, as we try and place pictorially the scale of emissions and the actual global footprint, the global carbon footprint, as it would look conceptually if we plotted it like this. And clearly, brothers and sisters, the highest emitters have the largest bubbles, and the smaller emitters, almost showing every nation on the earth, have a commensurate bubble attached. Well, carbon footprint discourse is political. We can't run away from that. And it's not really a black and white issue, because every country has some emissions, somewhat. But seriously, it is racial and very divisive. Because when we look at this map, you will discover that the global southern countries that are not white or Eurocentric or Europe-oriented have the tiniest blurbs on this footprint. And the Western nations have larger blurbs. However, because there is a blurb associated with every nation, I come to this table to suggest that at some point, as we share the same globe, we are all culpable generationally as beneficiaries of fossil fuel-driven development. And we all bear some level of responsibility, though it can be different. The threat from the changing climate has been great. According to Oxford, the poorest half of about 4 billion of the world's population is responsible for just 10% of carbon emissions, while the richest 10% are responsible for almost half of the greenhouse gases. And a person in the wealthiest 1% uses 175 times more carbon than one in the bottom 10%. And when we look at which nationalities consider religion most important, and how it is that we're trying to couch creation stewardship within our religiosity, perhaps there's hope. The United States is right in the middle of this graph or this graphic. And you find countries like Ethiopia, Senegal, Indonesia, Uganda, Pakistan, Tanzania being right at the top. Again, it shows that our brothers and sisters in these countries of the global south place a greater premium on religion, thus challenging the religion of polluting states that lead from the front with runaway streaks on the graphics we started off with at the beginning. And those countries on this graphic happen to be at the bottom of the table. Can it be God when some have so much and others have so little? Can it be God when creation begins to rage this way? Raging, it seems, more against those who are disproportionately experiencing the brunt of the shifting climate. Can we consider how climate change is a significant contributor to haves and have-nots? Those haves and have-nots that are on the heart of Jesus in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. The hungry, the thirsty, the strangers, migration and climate change. How many of us actually link those two? The imprisoned. Some have stolen food to feed families because their land was no longer yielding anything. Not to condone that, but some of these linkages should make people of faith highly uncomfortable and begin to think about what Isaiah 58 also says to us about the true fast, the big justice question. Who exactly is under your carbon footprint when you don't care? It's the poor who are already at the margins. It's also our posterity. As Jesus tarries, our posterity will definitely suffer. And that in itself should touch the hearts of us who live today. It's also the environment and other life. In March 2019, and perhaps this is of interest to Bruno Berg, we experienced a shock, a strange shock, where a cyclone lifted monumental rocks and obliterated settlements in the Eastern Highlands. This settlement here had 300 households, but was leveled. The rocks that you see here buried people, animals, gardens, and this had never happened before in the history of Zimbabwe. And knowing that cyclones are maritime by origination and caused by movements of high pressure air, one begins to see that the environment can never be stable as the climate shifts and the people cannot be at peace. And in Zimbabwe, we've been experiencing an increased frequency and duration of droughts. Droughts used to be 5 years apart, rather 10 years apart. And with time, over a 30-year period, they became 5 years apart, then 3 years apart. Now, Southern Africa experiences perpetual drought. And this has all been happening against a low adaptive capacity and weakened resilience, meaning that communities, which communities greatly depend on agriculture, are very weakened in being able to bounce back and bounce forward at endowment levels that are better than before disaster struck. So this increase in agricultural vulnerability has meant that communities need to think harder about changing their estate in water insecurity. We've seen a lot of communicable diseases like cholera and typhoid. Food insecurity has meant that our children are stunted. Mental development is way below the optimum levels. Pregnant and nursing mothers are also malnourished. And stress-related diseases have meant that more people are hypertensive and more people have had to go without the necessary medical attention because the health systems have broken down. And just today, the government of Zimbabwe, from the Ministry of Health, sent out a bulletin to alert people that with the protracted drought and the increasing temperatures, people should be aware that chickenpox and heat rash will also be on the increase. It is in the global south in general where we find extreme poverty, with people living at less than $1.25 a day. I've been in the United States for a little more than a year, and I know that you can hardly feed a family with less than even $1.90 a day, which is the revised United Nations poverty indicator for daily subsistence per day. The declining livelihoods and resource-based conflicts, say for grazing lands, or for the commons, or forest goods like fruit and berries, have seen lots of conflicts erupting within rural areas where most of the populations live. In these pictures, the picture above is of a group of men trying to work the land conventionally with draft oxen. And below, we have a picture from the Nepal, from one of the MCC programs, showing women queuing for water. In Zimbabwe, this is actually now happening in urban areas where it hasn't rained sufficiently and there is not enough water for urban use. And it's at such places in rural Zimbabwe where women and girls get attacked, get raped, experience sextortion just to get ahead of the queue and get a bit of water for personal care and domestic use. The death of subsistence agriculture because of the shifting climate has had a domino effect of weakening industry, causing deindustrialization, astronomical unemployment, informalization of the economy, meaning there is no useful or significant revenue with which to drive common and public utilities, migration, the missing middle, regional tensions. Because I said we're landlocked, it means that any mass movement of people out of Zimbabwe affects the countries in the sub-region. And of course, you may have heard xenophobia because of social upheavals caused by this mass influx of foreigners and hatred of people hating foreigners in their country. We've also unfortunately continued to suffer because of the effects of HIV and AIDS, meaning that households who work the land have a high average age and tend to have insufficient labor for manual work. And this has meant that the cycle has been vicious in terms of food security. And in light of the weak social safety nets, some ecosystem imbalances have been experienced, and they include lack of goods that come when it rains, like mopani worms. These turn up as interesting, I don't know what Bruno would call them, but they're like a type of proteinaceous caterpillar that can be prepared and stored to be eaten right across the year, even during lean times. When it rains, we experience what we call flying rain ants. And these are the coping foods that households, both rural and urban, depend on when times are hard. And without these, you can only imagine what the state of hunger and famine is like in Zimbabwe. Colleagues from Nepal, like colleagues in Zimbabwe, tell of how the mosquito infestation has been serious because of the consistently rising temperatures. And where malaria should have been rolled back by 2020, we're experiencing an upsurge. The death of trees and bees.
Five more minutes, Sibonokuhle.
Thanks. The death of trees and bees speak to death of the food chain, and many of us would imagine what that means. So I have to start talking about some of the things that we've done, or I have done together with civil society, the government, and households at community level. We've tried hard to change our cropping methodology so that we look after the earth, and we've tried to use conservation agriculture, and farmers versus conventional agriculture have been experiencing higher yields, up to 300% of what they'd normally get. We've tried to shift food crops away from the maize, the corn that was brought in by the colonizing column, back to small grains that are more drought resistant. We've begun to introduce communities to ideas of what clean energy could look like, so that communities don't continue pressing into the forests and affecting the local climate. We have been working hard at helping communities look after their livestock as the conventional banking method in community, and a change in architecture so that there is a way of retaining water rather than letting it flow off whenever it does rain. And peace building has been a central concern in the work that we've been doing with communities, apart from the policy level issues, to ensure that even in the global south and in Zimbabwe, people begin to change their ways and their relationship with the environment. I'd like to talk more about what else can be done. Because of time, I'm thinking about rehumanization and redignification, to say, perhaps let's go back to the mind of God and imagine what this means when we begin to think morally. How can we stop the injustices caused by the changing climate? Theologically, what would it mean to also include a climate response within our peacemaking? Practically, what does it mean to us in the global north? Our convictions, what do they say we should begin to do? Sometimes we imagine that one person is too little to cause the shift to change this direction. But here we're talking about and looking forward to numbers being convicted. Sometimes for others it's repentance. And for all of us globally, we need to change our ways. An intergenerational response that draws in our young people, that draws in our midlers, that draws in our seniors, and have us all engaged in what is essentially an existential concern, a policy response. Where should we be speaking to our local leaders about policy changes? And a political response for those of us who are involved in the democratic issues, including the elections, those of us who are voting. What are these candidates saying about a vibrant climate response? And how about our relationships? What can we do to heal our relationships? Because the question here is actually, who is under our carbon footprint? Insulation may make it seem like it's just a global south problem. It's just a problem that affects the poor. But perhaps it should be our common problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibonokuhle. And we do now have 5 minutes for any questions that anyone wants to ask in the chat, or go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask a question.
This is Pat Kraybacher. I'm relatively new to any environmental discussions, but I am a volunteer working in Nigeria and Haiti and on the Global Food Initiative for the Church of the Brethren. And one thing that I've been learning a lot lately about is regenerative agriculture. Is that what you meant by intensive agric? You had gone away from other traditional practices, and I think your chart said intensive. But I'm learning at how effective that working to build soil health is relatively easy and can be done relatively quickly, and then avoid a lot of expense for inputs like pesticides and nutrition, if that's, or nutrients. But I just wondered what you meant by that change in agricultural practices, because I think that is significant and key to our global, healing of the ground will heal our atmosphere.
Sure. I meant that we have been trying to influence farmers away from the extensive conventional farming methodologies that depend on, say, broadcasting, seed and soil inversion, and opting instead to promote conservation agriculture, which is minimum tillage and places a premium on conservation and keeping the soil persistently undercover throughout the seasons, so that we protect the soil from runoff and also build nitrogen via, say, green manure cover crops, which can be used not only for extending the human dietary diversity, but also servicing livestock needs. And regeneration is a little different, but especially in terms of species replacement and soil healing, regeneration would then come in strongly. And hence conservation agriculture would tend to be intense per square area compared to the conventional forms that people have been using in recent years. But minimum tillage, it appears, exists in our institutional memory of old, before modernization began to take its course. So thank you, Patricia, for that question. I hope I've been clear.
Well said, sister. I'll be praying for you all because I think that is key to the future of our earth.
Yes. And we're glad that the government of Zimbabwe has placed, of all the things the government could do, some of the very good policies have actually been agricultural policies, because Zimbabwe used to be the bread basket of Africa. We are a very small country, but we used to feed the continent and also export to the United Kingdom and Brazil. But now we are a net food importer, importing even toothpicks.
So we just have time for one more quick question and quick response if anyone has something.
I'm curious about fertilizer, and I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question, but my understanding is that when Western countries kind of invaded into Africa, they introduced at one point a lot of fertilizer, which is based on oil. And I was wondering how many of the countries, or to what extent the countries that you're aware of on that continent, became very based on fertilizer, and if that is something that you're trying to pull away from at this point.
Yes, thank you, Sue. That's a very important question, and quite true. It's almost wholesale. Fertilizer use seems to have been commensurate with the modernization project and the profit-making project, but the soils are tired, the soils are leached, because fertilizer use also came with monoculture, and we may be aware of the dangers of monoculture, especially in destroying the soil structure and destroying natural soil organisms. So conservation agriculture tends to encourage organic fertilizers. And this is quite a big thing, actually, going back to the memory of what organic is and how to make sure that this is something that can be sustained not only domestically, but have farmers collaborate at village level to do this together. And this is why I was saying our programming, say with MCC as a partner, has made sure that we also place a premium on peacemaking, because our communities are divided politically, are divided tribally, and surely they cannot work together or farm together when relationships are broken. So going organic is the big thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibonokuhle. Thank you for bringing in that peacemaking perspective, along with just some of the practical agricultural perspectives and orienting us to the global issues around this. Will you be able to stay afterwards? I don't know if everyone was here at the beginning, but we will be able to continue to talk past 8:30 if you're available to do that, just so people are aware of that. But I think we will now go to Reverend Marcia Dinkins. So
Thank you.
thank you, Sibonokuhle.
That was so good evening, everyone. I am Bishop Marcia Dinkins, and it is such an honor and a privilege to be here. Sibonokuhle, thank you. I learned a lot and from your presentation, and really just see like the commonalities that we have from the Gulf South to where we are today locally. And so my presentation, if I can get it up, will really introduce you to the local aspect of the work, and with regards to climate change and here it is, with regards to climate and environment as well as race. And am I sharing my screen now? Can everybody see the screen?
We can see it, yeah. So you just
I know it says thank you. I didn't go through yet. All right. So again, I will be talking to everyone, and what you'll see is there's so many similarities in the PowerPoints in the presentation, but I will be looking at what's happening here in our country and locally and statewide and nationally. And although I was asked to speak to climate and racism or race, as I was praying through this, it was just quickened to me to bring environment into this. And so because climate change is not racist, you know, and that's what we have to remember. Climate change is just a response to the racist actions or to capitalism. And so we know that in the beginning, Genesis 1:1, we know that we saw God take a very chaotic situation. And I kind of look at this, there's so much going on in this photo that took a chaotic situation or a disorderly situation and brought order to it. And so we know that climate really is God's creation. Environment is also God's creation, and humanity is God's creation. These are the thing that we have in common, and this is the thread that brought us together. And inside of this, we're supposed to be in relationship one with another, not have the divisions or the isms. And so just like the fall in the garden, we also see the fall today as we live. And so we look at the man-made destruction with climate, which is global warming, increased climate destruction, that wreaks sickness. And with our environment, the man-made destruction impacts our food security. It brings forth pollution. We have unsafe drinking water, deforestation, and extraction of resources. As well as this man-made destruction has an impact on God's creation. And so it created race. Racism is just something that's created. We know that God, he created race. We hear the story of Noah and how he had sons of 3 different colors. But man went even further and decided that they wanted to use what was good and great to something more divisive. And so we have birthed racism. And then we have poverty, unjust policies, and greed. All of these things are man-made, not God-made. And so when we think about the results of this man-made destruction, These are the results. We see where people are, as Sibonokuhle also pointed out, where they're losing homes. We see waters rising. We see floods. We see deforestation. We see massive loss and suffering. We see where families are relocated. We see where people become refugees. We see just a lot of hurt and pain. And I think that's the most important or critical thing inside of this whole issue with climate change and environmental racism or racism is the pain, is the depth of the pain. And we can't separate climate from environment. We have to remember when we're talking about the climate, we're also talking about the environment. And so here we see where climate change, and if the picture, you can see the shininess of the picture, that's the water that has risen up because of what's going on in that community. But we also see the environmental hazards, what's taking place when people come in. So we see abandoned homes. We see homes that are on fire. We don't see a whole lot of greenage. We see some of the bushes and the grass, but even that's growing out of control. And inside of this, when you put climate and environment together, it wreaks a whole lot of other things, mold, and if you go into some people's homes, there's mushrooms. But what we see is just the impact. And I wanted to bring home, the impact, between, and the connection between climate and environmental, because we can't talk about one without the other. And a lot of times in the work that I do, a lot of people tend to want to talk about them separately when actually they should be woven together. And so what's the real problem? Is it climate or environment or both? And where does race fit in? Where does race really fit in? Or better yet, where does racism really fit in? And they really all are the problem. And so I just want to break it down. So what we see here is what I call the ecosystem. And the ecosystem begins with the economics of it all. When we talk about climate, when we talk about environment, we're talking about an entire ecosystem. And it starts off with taxes. And then from taxes, it moves over to health and healthcare. And from there, it goes to jobs, and then jobs to housing, and housing to food, and food to water, and water to poverty, and poverty to coping, and coping to the criminal legal system. And it just becomes this perpetual vicious cycle. And what we see is that even though all of these things is what God intended for to be good for us and to be used to help create wealth and to create opportunities, man-made destruction has taken these things and promoted it in such a way that it becomes unhealthy. We see that because of taxes, the top 1%, they have more wealth than anybody. We're already in a fight when we're talking about healthcare. And so when we talk about climate, we have to remember that we're also talking about health. And I say all of this because a lot of times, again, people always ask me, and I've did congregational-based organizing for years, where do I fit in at? This doesn't impact me. This doesn't affect me. Why should I get involved? Why should I get engaged? I really care about, people going to jail. I really care about, reducing the number of people who are incarcerated. Well, the problem is you can't care about people who are incarcerated, because climate affects them as well. We often talk about those who are living in poverty, but we also have to look at those who are marginalized. And so when we get to that point, we're looking at people in the criminal legal system. When the water rises, where do they get to go? When they're cleaning inside of the prison systems, who are the chemicals impacting? You have people who go in healthy and come out with all types of pre-existing health conditions. You have women who are in prisons who definitely come out with health issues because of what's been going on in both the climate and the environment of where they're housed at. You have people who live in good communities, but they have poor health conditions because of the fact of there's flooding and there's, from the flooding, and once the weather gets a little warmer, then you start seeing some of these other unhealthy things come about, as I said earlier, as mold or mushrooms in people's basements. And so the air that they're breathing is very toxic. And then if I don't have good health or access to healthcare, then I can't work. And so here we just see the spiraling effects that if my health is hampered because of my environment or the climate, I don't have access to any of these other things. And where does racism fit in at? Racism fits in because it is unjust policies that are manufactured by legislators who just set policies that only benefit one type of person. We call it necropolitics. It's determining who gets to live and who gets to die. Or as Sibonokuhle said, the have and the have-nots. And this is a system that begins to perpetuate the division or the isms that we experience inside of the space of climate change and environmental racism, that they then jointly fit together, because what they're doing is just kind of feeding off of one another. And so yes, climate change does impact people who live in low income neighborhoods. It does impact those who are economically disenfranchised, because there are laws such as redlining that have moved people over into these areas, or they're living in areas where these are old landmines, and or pollution is right in their communities. And because of the policies, the racist policies, these are things that continue to perpetuate these things in their lives. And so I like the picture at the bottom when you think about the water. You know, there's clean water, which is the white water, and then there's colored water. And so you go to places like Toledo or Cleveland who have high rates of lead. And the truth is, this is what their water looks like. And so we began to see, even in those areas, it's still in the communities where people they don't have access to good jobs. They don't have access to food security. They don't have access to affordable or good housing. And because of that, and because of being punished by being in poverty, they are losing out on clean water or fresh food or healthcare. And then what do? They go into coping. And so one of the things that I saw where Sibonokuhle talked about was some of the coping mechanisms that people went to. And so for us here, especially in the health aspect, a lot of people are this is why we have the opioid crisis. And so the drug crisis begins to also take an impact, in our environment as well as within our communities. The systems are the oppressive threads. And so this is where we really get into the part of racism: white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, systemic oppression, institutional oppression, structural oppression. As I said earlier, necropolitics, representation. Who's at the decision-making table? Who's helping to make these decisions? Who's helping to build out these policies? Who's even doing a political analysis, to look at what's going to be the cost of this? Who's going to benefit from it? Who are politicians, or even, to be honest with you, people who work in policy, and I work with a lot of people who are policy wonks. They're the ones who are representing everybody at the table. And a lot of times we just can't go to the data. We're missing the voices of those who are directly impacted. We're missing the voices of Black people. We're missing the voices of people who are economically disenfranchised. And this is what I mean by representation. And then the politics and the policies. This is where racism comes in at. As I said earlier, climate is not racist. Neither is environment. What's racist is what we see here, these very oppressive threads that have already made the determination on who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets to have and who doesn't get to have, who's deserving to have clean water and clean air and who isn't. And unfortunately, that's how it shows up. We see, because of George Floyd, people have really capitalized on the moment and began to connect these threads together with the very statement of, I can't breathe. But before George Floyd, people in low income neighborhoods, they couldn't breathe because of the pollution, because of the racist policies that kept them over there. We were saying we couldn't breathe when our children were having asthma attacks. We were saying we couldn't breathe because of the communities that we lived in. And so what has happened is now the conversation around race has really heightened in the area, simply around climate and environmental, and I'd say more so of climate than environment, is because of what has happened with George Floyd. And again, anybody can push back, but climate doesn't have eyes. Climate is man-made destruction that just continues to perpetuate a set of problems over and over again. Fracking is one, fossil fuels is another, deforestation is another. And inside of that, what they continue to do is to economically oppress people and to push those problems on them. So when people would say, when the government has a cold, Black people have the pneumonia. And it's just where the impact lies. And if we talk about it from that perspective, more so than just saying this is a racist perspective, because yes, there is some racial tenets in it. But at the same time, we have to look at, you know, where do those tenets fit in at? And it fits in, again, as policy. So environmentally, we see infant and maternal mortality, but that's due to how our environment is structured. It's due to people not caring and pushing people aside, but it doesn't all connect nicely to one thread. And I say that because studies have shown that women who suffer even from infant and maternal mortality due to environmental, as we would say, racism, these are women who still have 2 and 3 degrees. So it's really not so much as just that part of it, but the things that continue to perpetuate the stress upon those individuals who are living in those areas. And so I still have to ask, you know, is it really just racism, or is it really just the fact of the outcome of the man-made destruction that we go through and that we live through in our lives? And is it racism or is it capitalism? And when we can decide which one of those containers that it nicely fits in, then we can begin to deal with it in a way that becomes progressive, that it becomes a form of us healing. When we are asked, what are we called to do in this space? What are we called to do when we talk about racism? What are we called to do when we talk about climate? What are we called to do when we talk about environment? The truth of the matter is we're called to heal. We're called to heal the ills of the land. We're called to heal in a way that brings about a collective grieving for collective healing. We're called to do the work of justice, but we're also called to a point of clarity. We're called to a point where we have to come together as people of God under the hand and the nature of God to repair and to heal the land. We speak these scriptures out a whole lot. We talk about, if my people who are called by my name will just humble themselves. And so we need to figure out, what does healing look like for us? I know that I should have spent more time on racism, but I'll be honest with you. In putting this together, I was tagged in my spirit. I was tagged as I prayed, because the question I kept asking is it really racism or is it greed? Is it capitalism? Is it the fact that we have people who continuously want to benefit economically off of the hurt and pain of people? And from that, because of what this foundation has been built upon, which has been capitalism, it continues to perpetuate the harms upon people. And because these harms, or the people that these laws were formed against, were Black people, were indigenous people, were people who were economically disenfranchised, was it about the race or was it about the disenfranchisement? And then if it's that way, then how do we talk about it? So I say that because I think if we want to get into dialogue and we want to wrestle and grapple with this, then I'm opening up space to wrestle and grapple with this, because I too am wrestling and grappling with this. We tend to just try to thread these things together. But what we have to realize is these are people-centered issues, where all of these issues land on the body of everybody. They land on all of us. COVID landed on all of us. COVID isn't racist. Climate set it up for us quite nicely. The climate change and all of the environmental hazards set it up quite nicely for COVID to come in. And so as we begin to heal, we have to begin to think about the narrative and change the narrative. And so I didn't have a lot of slides because I'd like for us to grapple with that for a few minutes if we could, so that we're confronting this issue or this problem in a very meaningful way, as Sibonokuhle said, so that we can begin to heal. And we can define what healing looks like in the spaces that we live in and in the spaces where we're putting our hands to work for the glory of God. So the space is open to wrestle.
Marcia, there's a couple questions that have come in the chat, if you'd like to read and address those.
Sure, hold on. You're making me really savvy today.
I can read them to you too, Marcia, if you don't have them in front of you.
So it says, I think it's asking me, could you share 2 or 3 striking examples of how environmental harm has been pushed onto or impacted people of color in Ohio? Yep, you're looking at one example. And I would say this, I encourage everybody to not assimilate Black people under the guise of people of color. We have to name and claim particular spaces in order for everybody to be included in this agenda. And I just say that because we tend to say people of color, and every person of color is not a Black person. And because Black people in philanthropic areas, and as well as policy agendas, or even just the organizing work, we tend to get overlooked because we say people of color. But I understand. So I'll say that one of the ways that environmental impact has been pushed onto or impacted people of color, I used to live in Toledo, Ohio, and I lived in a neighborhood that was desirable. However, what happened in that neighborhood is that when it rained, everybody's basement flooded. Everybody's basement at one time flooded. And when you live in these historic districts or these historic homes, you can make only limited changes. And with that being said, the flooding was so bad that it came up to my knees one day and I had to have on boots. When the water resided, then the temperature and the moisture and all of that inside of the basement began to cause white mushrooms to grow in my basement, which in turn made it difficult for me, and I have a son who has asthma, to live. And then mold began to grow as well inside of the home. And I went into anaphylactic shock. And I stayed in anaphylactic shock on and off for 5 days. And I had anywhere between 3 and 30 minutes to get to the hospital because of those harmful reactions, or the harm that the environment brought to my home and in our community in order for me to live. And so those are some of the ways. Another way is lead. When you think about lead poisoning in the water, for every 5 deciliters that a child has of lead that a child has in their system, they lose an IQ point. And so what happens is those children, and lead is not anything that you can heal from. Lead is a silent killer. And it's not something that they're testing for now. It used to be a time where if a mother got WIC, her child would be tested for lead and they would know. Now they're not doing that. Medicaid, I believe, is the only provider who does it. And other providers, they opt to do it within a certain age frame and then they don't. And so what happens is another one of those environmental hazards. We see our children, especially Black children and children who live in low income neighborhoods, having high rates of lead because lead comes from the soil. Children are not eating the paint chips. They're getting it from the soil. They're getting it from playing in the dirt and then coming in and doing what they do with their hands. And then from there, it's in their system. And as they grow, more of the lead is released from the calcium in their bones. And there are just certain ways that you can change it. And food is one of them. And that's why food security is important. But those are some of the impacts that it has with regards to children, Black children, and children who live in communities of color. And I can't say it's really been pushed onto them, but I will say that some of these things have been overlooked for quite some time, and because of it being overlooked, it's impacted our children. What are specific things we should do with capitalism to begin the healing? That's a good question. What are some of the things that we should do with capitalism? One of them is you're going to have to get out and vote. And because part of the capitalistic, it's a system, that's what we have to remember. And this country was built on that system. And I'm not sure how we do that other than rethinking about ways that we can generate wealth or create wealth and careers that are opposite of that. But what I do encourage is that we have these different conversations. We create equity and equality, because capitalism is really formed upon greed and who gets to deserve, and it lies within the system of white supremacy. And I'm not sure if it's anything that we would see in our lifetime that would get us to a place of healing. But I can say that I think the first part of it is that we do have to, people who have access to other white people and who knows that these things are perpetuated in the communities that they live, in the places that they work, in the homes that they live, or in the relationships that they keep. The first step is going to have to be is having these real conversations around conversations that we haven't had to have. And that would be a conversation around racism that's attached to capitalism, and beginning to talk with one another and grapple with one another in that space. Because it started with white people and it started with greed. And I believe it's up to white people to have conversations with other white people, to wrestle and grapple with the tensions around that, and begin to rethink about what equity and equality looks like. And how do you dismantle those things? But the first part to healing anything is acknowledging and is awareness and acknowledgement, and the ability to be able to sit with yourself and be uncomfortable sitting with yourselves in those moments and having those hard conversations.
And there was, I don't know if you saw, there's one more question, and I think we just have time for one more question.
How has white Christianity failed us when it comes to environmental racism? Gosh, you all are asking me some questions that's going to get me disbanded from the church. I would say, look at some of the evangelicals and what they push for. That's how white Christianity has failed us. When you think about evangelicals, I like Catherine Hayhoe, and I'm just, I'm not talking about her, I'm just truthing about her. And what I learned from Catherine Hayhoe is how evangelicals have this layer of faith. And so you can say to her, do you believe in climate change? And she'll say, no, I don't believe in climate change. And I'm not saying anything that's not publicly out here or that I could publicly share where she admits that. She'll say, I believe in Jesus. And so where white Christianity has failed us is pushing for unjust laws. White Christianity has failed us when you have faiths that are out here lobbying not to treat women or to treat Black people or to treat people that's against their religion. It has failed us in a way that it does push back, even around birth control. And birth control, and I say this because birth control is not because you don't want to have children. Birth control is a method that has been used to save lives. And I'm not telling anybody I'm not bringing in a repro health conversation or anything like that. I'm just saying where I know in policy, what has been pushed that can help save people, white evangelicals, or those who are lobbying their faith, which is some of the white Christians, has really failed us, because the things that we need, like trying to dismantle the ACA, the things that we need to heal, they're lobbying against it. They're pushing against it. They're in denial against these things. And so we have to look at, we can be these credible messengers to drive and change the narrative. First, we need to depoliticize all of this and quit trying to legislate our faith. And that's how another way that they failed us, because our faith was never put up to be legislated. It was put up there to be spread, to help and to heal and to bridge the gaps for others. And so that's been that moral failure of really being more having a desire for power in the public's way, rather than having